And good morning to you, Nicole. I'm great. I just had a plumber leave my house, and we had quite the night. No, I'm I'm getting.
Did you get your pipes fitted?
You should, don't. I haven't had enough coffee. This will get awful, and I'm streaming live. So no, we're not. Welcome. Good morning, everybody, to Morning Walk and Plumber Talk.
Oh Lord,
Yep.
it's fine. I apologize.
Gave Nicole the giggles. I'm all excited about this.
Aside from that, how's your morning going so far?
Morning is going fantastically. It's still kind of chilly here in Maine, but it is sunny. So that's a big step forward. We're moving towards some level of spring. I know I give everybody the daily update of how shitty the weather is here in Maine, but it is what it is. You're the ones that tune in, so this is what you get. You get the weather report. All right.
We gotta just accept that that's how it's gonna be.
Mm-hmm.
I see Wynn and Erica and MJ and Bobby with us this morning, as well as Tara and Noel, Diego, Justin, and Robert. Welcome, everybody. So glad to have you with us. Hope your day is going well also. I think we'll give just another minute or so to see if any of our other panelists can join us.
And just to kind of, I'm sorry, I was just going to tell the people down below, in case you're wondering and you want to actually kind of watch this happen live, I am streaming. We're kind of taking this week and doing a little bit of a simulcast experiment. So on the Stone Tree Creative Facebook page or the Stone Tree Creative YouTube channel, I'm streaming this conversation live. So if you wanted to watch me stumble through facial gestures and expressions as Nicole talks and I get really confused, then you can do all that live and you can see Nicole's headshot and anybody else that speaks. So we're trying it out, see if you guys like something a little bit different, see if you want to interact on a video from a video standpoint rather than just on Clubhouse. So let us know if it works for you, if it doesn't, but it's a great way to have all the replays as well if you just kind of want to watch that. So I'm sure we'll bring it to the Artist Forge page at some point soon, but we're running through all the bugs right now to see how it works. So if you feel like checking it out, go ahead over to those channels or just stay exactly where you are because we love you having you in the room. So
both.
Do it both.
If you want to watch Matt pretend not to be a cyborg by mimicking facial expressions of actual humans.
It's something.
Sorry. Apparently my funny bone has been tickled this morning. I also will be walking my kiddo to school. So it will be potentially just a little bit louder than usual for me since I have to stay close to main roads. So fair warning for folks. I do have potentially controversial topic to chat about this morning. So I hope we will be ready and prepared for that. And fair warning to the audience, we really want to hear from you guys. I think this is an important question to weigh in on. And so if you would be willing to come up and share your ideas and thoughts today, or just to go ahead and put them in the chat, we would appreciate you for that because I want to be able to get folks' feedback on this topic. So let me get us started for today by saying good morning, everybody, and welcome to Morning Walk with the Artist Forge. My name is Nicole York. I'll be your host. I am here with the wonderful Matt Stagliano, where we gather together every morning to learn to think like artists. The topic for conversation today is a question: should art have trigger warnings? The reason I'm asking this question is because more and more in many of the art spaces that I inhabit, I'm seeing a trend of creators toward ensuring that their art is safe to consume across the board. So essentially, much the same way that you would see a rating system for a movie that you were going to watch, there are warnings before the content is shared or observed or read, as in books, that warn people about things that could be potentially triggering, like sexual assault or other issues that might cause somebody to have a negative reaction. To qualify this, I think it is also fair to be super clear that these types of warnings, which are different from health warnings, so if there's a warning for something like strobing lights or other issues that may actually cause somebody to have a health-related issue, such as seizure for somebody who has epilepsy or heart issues, those are a different category of thing. The original purpose of trigger warnings was for folks who had PTSD or complex PTSD, where they may have a flashback or some other deeply negative reaction to the type of content they're seeing. Somehow this has been extended as well in an approach, if not in purpose, to just let people know what kind of content is going to be included in the art that they may find they want to avoid, or that they may find uncomfortable, that could potentially affect their mood or whatever else. And I'm seeing a big growth of this preference for things like trigger warnings in some of the art spaces that I inhabit. And I am deeply conflicted about the idea, because while, of course, I want to be considerate of people who have things like complex PTSD, I also don't necessarily believe that art should be safe. So I'm not entirely certain where I fall on the issue, except that I feel really uncomfortable with it in general. And the larger these communities grow and the more influential they become, as an example, in Book Talk, which is a subset of TikTok where people get together and talk about books and review books and share books, has been really incredibly influential in the regrowth of stores like Barnes and Noble, who have now set aside tables specifically for books that are popular on, or books that TikTok recommends. There's also an entire category on Amazon that's like Book Talk made me do it. And so the popular opinion in these groups is now driving sales. There are authors who are seeing their sales change or skyrocket because of their participation on things like Book Talk. And I know that there are other communities as well. Reddit has proved its strength over the past by getting behind certain art or certain artists or certain authors. And so as the democratization of art continues, and as we are forced to take into consideration more often how people respond to our work, this question of trigger warnings is going to, I think, probably continue to grow from things not just like movies or plays, which are now actually happening in some theaters, to things like potentially other works of art. Will we need to include trigger warnings for our websites or other things like that? I'm not sure how that's going to go. But there are people very, very passionately for and against this topic. So first, I want to make sure that when we have this conversation today, we're being just super, I know how we will speak to each other. We're going to be considerate and talk about the idea. There will be no ad hominem attacks, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean everybody's going to be comfortable with this conversation. So even acknowledging that in a way is a bit of a trigger warning, and a understanding that this is not a place to be safe from ideas, right? And the discussion of ideas. So with that in mind, I have to begin by asking my panelists today, and also the audience members, be thinking about this. Should art have trigger warnings? I'll be interested to hear what you think. If you are in the audience today, feel free to put something in the chat. After the panelists have had a chance to discuss this a little bit, we will bring people up. So what do you think, my moderators? What do you think?
No, I don't think any art should have any trigger warnings. And I know I'll probably catch flack for this, but I don't really believe, if I search my heart of hearts, I don't really believe anything should have trigger warnings. I think we as people need to be responsible for ourselves. I don't think we need to look for other people to necessarily protect our feelings or to let us know what we're about to walk into. If it's unsafe physically, sure, let's have some protection there. But there's a woodpecker right outside my window eating my house right now. Apologies. There, I don't believe there should be any trigger warnings on art because it is such a subjective medium. I don't think that it's our responsibility to tell people you might get offended or this might trigger something. I believe that the act of doing that diminishes the art because you are trying to say, well, I know this is going to offend some people rather than just kind of putting yourself out there. I'm just not a fan of it in any way, shape, or form. I'm not a fan of it on social media. I'm not a fan of it in art galleries. I'm not a fan of it in anime. I don't believe in any of that. I think we should be able to be responsible for ourselves and don't need to look to someone else to tell us what we should think or feel. I think you absolutely have the right to change a channel, not listen to something, not watch something, not go visit a museum. If you find yourself in a situation that you didn't know that you were going to get triggered, and you can understand, I'm going to remove myself from this situation. This isn't something that I want to see, rather than complain about it or attack or anything like that. These are beliefs that I've had for a really long time. I know I'm not going to change my ways. I try to be empathetic to people's feelings. My art isn't necessarily something that causes a lot of controversy in what I do. But I also don't feel the need that I need to caveat anything that I create either. Either like it or you don't. You're either approve of it or you don't. But I really don't feel like it's my responsibility to cater to how someone might feel. This is me expressing myself and putting my art out there. If you have a problem with it, I will discuss it with you. I will be purely respectful of your opinions, but it doesn't mean that I need to change what I do or how I operate to accommodate somebody else. I just don't think it's that way. So art from a pure standpoint, no, I don't think it needs to have trigger warnings. So I'm going to leave that there.
You bring up something interesting that I want to grab and address, because part of in the camp for people who are concerned about what this might presage for the future of art, one of the things that they've mentioned is the fact that trigger warnings and the need to be able to protect people may actually push artists to censoring their own art, being careful not to include certain things or to approach things in a certain way, being because they recognize the I guess pushback that they might get for dealing with certain topics or addressing certain kinds of things as the viewing or watching or reading or whatever community starts to become more sensitive to topics like this. And so I wonder, is that, it sounded like from your explanation that that is part of what concerns you, is this idea that needing to keep other people in mind for the making of your art may cause you to self-censor or filter or other things like that.
Yeah, totally. And I think people pretty much know my stance on censorship, that I don't believe in it. I don't think that art specifically should be censored. And I think once we start giving into, well, there might be someone somewhere at some time that might be offended, therefore I have to caveat all this stuff and put warnings on everything, I'm diminishing my capability to express myself as I want to. And I'm also catering to a very, very, very small minority that, quite frankly, I don't feel responsible for their feelings. And it can come across as crass or uncaring. But it's not that way at all. It's just I'm unapologetic with what I do. And I don't feel like I need to cater to somebody else in order to produce the work that I want to produce. I don't believe in censorship. I think we're all adults. And if we're viewing this stuff, we should have the emotional maturity to be able to handle anything that we see. If we don't like it, we extract ourselves from that situation or that conversation or that place where we're viewing art. But we do not need to make everybody else bend to our wills just because we tend to not like something, or it causes some other type of emotion in us. Now, I say that as a free speech advocate, as someone that's anti-censorship. I know the baggage that comes along with that and the ways that all of that can be exploited. However, if you go to the extremes, I don't need to put myself in situations where I know I'm not going to like it, or it doesn't align with my values or my beliefs. Or sometimes I put myself in those situations to deal with the feelings that I have and to understand myself a little bit better. But when I see something that I don't like, or that I wasn't expecting, or that makes me feel bad, or, you know, triggers something in me in a negative way, I can look at it and say, all right, I understand that that's what's happening to me. I'm not comfortable being here. I'm going to leave. That's where it ends. What I'm seeing more and more now are people dragging those feelings out to gain attention or validation, or, create some sort of mob mentality around, shouldn't everybody feel this way? Yeah. I watched this happen with censorship of, rap and hip hop way back in the 80s and 90s. And it's kind of coming around generationally again 30 years later. And I can't believe I just said 30 years later, because that was really like 5 years ago that NWA came out. So
that offends me. I don't like to hear that at all.
Yeah, I know. Speaking of trigger warning, old guy on the microphone. So I think, that's what I see is this. It's been this shift to catering to a small minority of people that get offended by everything. And without going on any sort of political side, I just feel like we should have the emotional maturity and responsibility of our own selves to deal with anything that comes our way. If not, you extract yourself from that. I know I'm saying the same thing 6 ways, but that's truly what I believe.
So Matt, I have a question.
Yeah.
Isn't the purpose then of a trigger warning to allow people to make that emotionally mature decision to interact with content or art or whatever it is for themselves?
I understand what you're saying, right? And it comes from that place, not of you, but like the posting a trigger warning comes from a place of wanting to make sure that the people that are viewing it are, the people that you want to view it, or that, can choose for themselves if they want to go see it. But I think you could do that for anything. I think, art as it is displayed, right? So let's take major media, right? So you've got museums, you've got social media, right? I don't feel like I need to put a trigger warning on everything that I would put out on social media. If you see my stuff and you get offended, block me, unfollow me, leave the platform, like whatever. But I don't feel like I need to think, oh God, okay, is this going to offend somebody? Because I think subconsciously that makes me start to alter what I'm doing, because it's one extra step to add a trigger warning. If I don't want to add a trigger warning, then I should probably tone down what I'm doing. I get what you're saying, Becca. I just feel like that's I'm doing too much to not offend somebody. And I think that for me alters what my mindset is going into the creation of the art. I'm not sure if I'm using my words correctly this morning, but does that get across? I just feel like we shouldn't have to do that. Shouldn't have to do it.
I don't know if it's really about offense. Like, I don't know if that's truly the function for people who actually would utilize a trigger warning on art. I don't know if it's really so much about something being offensive as it is like a note for them to mentally prepare for something if they're going to engage with it. So I feel like it isn't actually akin to censorship.
I think that's part of the interesting thing of this question in general, is what originally, which is why I kind of mentioned it at the beginning of the conversation, what was originally intended to be able to give a chance for people with something like complex PTSD to avoid things that may cause, we're not just talking about offense, it was originally intended for severe emotional triggering, which often results in things like flashbacks, right? I do not know the percentage of the population who actually suffer from that, but it kind of has evolved in ways that are far beyond just purely, for those folks in general, which is where the idea of, taking offense comes in. And so it's interesting that that kind of plays into this conversation as well. It not just being about offense. But one of the things that you mentioned there as well, Becca, which I've heard some people talk about, is the fact that having a kind of a warning before the art in a way kind of could potentially blunt the impact of the art or remove some of the surprise or poignancy if you walk expecting a certain type of thing to happen. And I'm not sure what you think about that, or if you've experienced that. Every now and then, maybe this is
Hey, Nicole.
only particularly as a writer. Yeah.
We lost you there for about 10 seconds. So that last sentence or two
Boo.
that you had, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was just saying that I was asking Becca if she thinks that the potential for those content warnings or trigger warnings before viewing the art might blunt some of the effect of the art. And the reason that I ask that is because as a viewer, and maybe this is only also because I am a writer, if I have a warning before a TV show, I will immediately start making, I will start having suspicions about who and what is going to be doing the thing. And like I said, maybe that has to do with being a writer and understanding story structure and being able to predict those types of things in advance. But yeah. Anyway, so I'm sorry. I feel like I really bobbled there, but the question is, do you think that those types of things dilute some of the impact of the art, or has that not been your experience?
I do think that, absolutely. And I know I was pushing back against Matt on the issue, but I'm honestly very conflicted on when and how to use those kind of trigger warnings, because I actually was thinking specifically about what warnings like that on a book, how that would impact my reading. So just like you said, I feel like I would then it would change the experience of reading the book. It would change how I interact with the story. And I feel like that goes even with visual art or many things too. I mean, it's one thing if you're like, if something is, say, like nonfiction writing and it contains a content warning or trigger warning, I feel like that has a very different effect on how you read something than on with something that is more speculative or creative. Like I don't think I've really ever used a trigger warning on any of my art, and it's not because I personally have a problem with them, but I just don't feel that anything that I've done needs to have one, I suppose. Because if I like, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna tag team on that one and say that's exactly part of the thing that worries me with those types of warnings is it feels like I am making a value judgment on who deserves to be warned and who doesn't, because I don't know all of what may trigger somebody. And if I prioritize certain warnings above others that I don't know about, I mean, that also feels a little bit wrong. And this because I personally have a few triggers that probably don't affect most people. And so I have to be able to manage those, because it's not the kind of thing anybody could warn you about anyway, because they wouldn't think to do that. So are some triggers more important than others? Like that, I guess that part of me worries about that part also.
Totally. I mean, like, who are we to, like, how are we supposed to know every person's emotional reaction? And if we put warnings on things, is that then going to remove an audience that may have otherwise enjoyed interacting with the art? Like, how can we possibly know? And it's so multifaceted, it's so complex, and like, even I just, again, don't know enough about trauma to speak, I think, in an educated manner on like the actual science behind it. But I mean, I'm sure there has been research done onto, how often do people actually heed a trigger warning? Even if it is something they know that is triggering for them, do they still go and interact with the thing? And how often does the trigger warning actually help people versus how much does it create, a new implication for the audience?
Yeah, in a way, it almost feels like a barrier between you and the experience, right? Like you must sign off on this possibility before you go and experience the work, which I think immediately affects the mindset, especially when part of the reason we interact with art is to deal with these complex feelings and emotions. And I mean, sometimes shock and awe is meant to be part of the art. And do we have some kind of a moral obligation to allow people to prepare themselves for that? And I don't know. I don't know that we do. I want to make sure we address a couple of the comments in the chat. So Ashanta saying, I don't think the question really speaks to censorship in that way. I think referring to Matt's comment earlier. When I heard the question, I thought assault, rape. Should those victims have a warning for what they're about to walk into? I don't think it should have a reflection on the artist's work, which is interesting. And definitely SA has probably the biggest and most common trigger warnings that I have seen, at least personal. I know that's anecdotal, but those seem to be the ones that show up more often than not. And as somebody who has both written about and dealt with this personally, I required myself to be able to work through my writing. I did not require myself to be able to deal with this through something like a trigger warning. In my personal stance, just for me, not for what I would be willing to do for others, but just for me, is I don't prefer trigger warnings in general. I am like Matt in that way. For me, I would rather be the one in control of, if I need to walk away, I need to walk away. If I'm reading something and it starts to hit those points, I can close the book. That's how I prefer to deal with it. But at the same time, as a creator of art and as a writer of novels that will go to wide audiences, I still have that confliction on whether or not I need to allow that to be a resource for other people. And then Jean saying, but who decides? We can see in Florida right now how vastly different people's trigger settings can be. So who decides? The artist, the platform? And I think that's definitely part of the question. If there is a responsibility, where does it lie? And the difficulty for me is I have not been able to bring myself to say whether there is a responsibility. I think the bigger part of me leans on no, but also there's that difficult part of not wanting to hurt folks who have those kinds of sensitivities, right? So there's it feels like a really difficult line.
One of the things that I said earlier is the difference between kind of like pure physical reaction and then kind of like mental and emotional reaction. So, for example, part of any sort of music these days, whether it's festivals or rock concerts or whatnot, is generally a warning that the light shows have become so incredible that it might trigger seizures, right? We saw that with anime years ago, right? As all these flashing lights were having a negative physical effect on people. I have no problem being like, hey, we're about to be flashing a ton of lights here. If that's something that you can't handle physically, then just know what you're walking into. But you don't go to
right, health warnings, right?
Health warnings, right? But you don't go to a Metallica concert and be like, you know what? It was really loud. I know that's their art, but it was really loud. I wish there was a trigger warning. You're going to a Metallica concert. It's going to be loud, right? And I think there's a lot of that is kind of tossed to the side, meaning if you're going to an art show of such and such an artist, my expectation is that you did a little bit of research beforehand. And if it's something controversial where you think you might get triggered, then maybe you don't go. I don't think it's the artist's responsibility to cater to the widest possible group. I think each artist will find their audience and that audience responds to the art that's being created. But I don't personally need to appeal to everybody. I think if it goes to a wider audience and there are alternate opinions, then that's perfectly fine. I think that is the point of art. I know that Parker Pfister put out a picture. God, must have been a year ago, thereabouts. And he put a picture of his online, and it was basically without caption. It was just an image, and it was pretty controversial. And he was just talking about art evoking emotion. Didn't say whether it needed to be good or bad, didn't try to explain what the image was. And the ensuing thread underneath it was wildly disparate opinions on what was being seen. And to me, that represented what real art is supposed to do. It's supposed to give you a range of emotions. It's supposed to make you stop and pause and think and feel. And I think if we're putting trigger warnings on what people are about to experience in an emotional way, then we're limiting ourselves. And I think, we're putting more emphasis on the people that are going to see it a certain way rather than what we may have intended. And I don't like the feeling that that has to be done. I think we should be able to take a little bit more responsibility for who we are and what we're feeling and put ourselves in situations and be able to deal with that. If something pops up where it doesn't go well with who I am and what I believe or experiences that I've had, then that to me says there's nothing wrong with the art. It's something that I have to address myself. It's not the artist's fault that they made that, and I'm perfectly valid in feeling what I'm feeling, but it wasn't the artist that caused these things in me. It was something else. And I feel like we've gotten so litigious these days that everything needs to have a trigger warning. And I don't feel that applies to art in the way that it would in a like triggering a physical reaction. Does that make sense? Or am I being
No, it makes sense.
Okay.
No, yeah, it makes sense. And I think part of the question on that, it's so intricately tied. Sorry, it's a bus. Experiencing those not safe emotions is such a big part of what art is. It's so foundational to what our experience of art is, that it certainly becomes part of the issue in dealing with art, which is why it's so hard, for me at least, to make these decisions comfortably in a way where I feel like I would be okay with whatever blowback were to happen because of that. And so, I mean, I want to ask, there's been a lot of discussion lately around the fact that mental health is physical health, right? Like that we need to, if we would go to the doctor for a physical health issue, we need to have the same care for our mental health. And for some folks who are working through really serious emotional issues, they need to treat that with as much care and as much seriousness as we would with our physical health. And so I think those are the people that I'm probably most concerned about, because while they are working their way through those things, there's always the potential that my work could be part of that affects them in a vastly different way than other people. Yeah.
But there's a risk tolerance there, right? That you have that, yeah, I produce this art. I want to be empathetic and sympathetic towards people that might have a certain reaction, but most likely the majority of people will not have that. So understanding that there might be blowback, understanding that there may be a situation that you have to deal with after the fact of the viewing, right? And you have to deal with, a minority of opinion. Well, there's a risk tolerance there. And I think that as an artist is individual, right? I have a relatively large risk tolerance. And I think that people that don't want to risk it are more likely to put trigger warnings in place. I don't have a problem with people doing it. I just don't feel it's for me, and don't feel in a grander sense that art needs to have that. If it
Sure. So if
You know?
I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is there should not be an expectation. If
Correct.
somebody chooses to do that because they're being extra careful for other people, then nobody has a problem with that. But there shouldn't be a kind of expectation or judgment if you don't fall into that category.
Absolutely. It's know your audience. Know who it is that you're putting this out there for. If you're working with certain groups where you know that there's a higher expectation that there might be some folks that are triggered, sure, put it there. I don't have a problem with how you want to put your art out there. I just don't think there should be that expectation.
For sure. I want to grab a couple more comments and then see if Becca has any thoughts before we start bringing up audience members. We've got some raised hands, so I want to grab y'all. In the comments, we have Carol saying it has become overdone. Art is such an optional thing. Jean saying just expanding this idea. So if art triggers you, should you be judged for your reaction to the art? Which I think is kind of meant to be that mirror of, if your art triggers, should you be judged for the fact that it triggers, right? And then Trish saying she's with Matt on this one. People need to deal with this thing internally. So I'd love to hear from Becca before we bring up some audience members. Have you had any additional thoughts during this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are all over the place. I mean, like, I even like in a more casual scenario, right? Like if you like recommend a movie to a friend, are you going to give them a trigger warning about the content of the movie? Like, by the way, this involves like some really, gross gore, or, it's pretty scary, or, there's an awful rape scene or something like that. Like, does that fall under that realm of trigger warning? Kind of, just in a different context. And I mean, it is a form of self-care, and it's up, to the audience to choose whether they engage with something that has a trigger warning. Like, even if it is something that may be very difficult for them to process, they can still choose to engage with it, but it is up then to them. But I am still overly conflicted on, is it the responsibility of the artist or the responsibility of the platform, or, like the Metallica concert example. I wouldn't expect Metallica to, make those kind of like warnings, but the concert venue, like if they need to maintain that relationship with their audience, and even if they are liable for any fallout there, maybe that is something that they are responsible for. So yeah, I'm all over the place a little bit, and I'm thinking too about like my own, like my own kind of trauma experience where like I did find something that was extremely triggering for me. And I guess to be a little bit candid here, my ex had an affair, and I started having very, very visceral reactions to women who looked like this other woman, and I did not expect that out of myself. It like caught me off guard. The first time it happened, I was sitting in a restaurant and the waitress vaguely looked like this woman, and I got sick to my stomach, and it was completely bizarre and unexpected, and I couldn't figure out my emotions. And so like I had to sit with the fact, like, is this something that I'm gonna have to avoid? Do I have to avoid tall brunettes for the rest of my life? Like that's not feasible. And I couldn't, for me personally, in working through those feelings, I didn't want to make it kind of central to my identity. And I would rather expose myself to those things that made me uncomfortable to work through the emotions that I was going through. And as far as I know, exposure therapy is a thing, right? And people do have to work through those processes, whatever their trauma may be. However, if they have the ability to have the control over how they have those experiences, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. But I also don't know how much of that responsibility, like Matt said already, falls on the artist.
That's such a good point, Becca, because it touches on exactly what we said earlier. And I see your hands. I'm about to grab you all. Hang in there. It touches exactly on what we said earlier, which is, how far does that responsibility go? I would have no way to know that maybe reading about a tall brunette or reading about a cheating scene or whatever else might trigger somebody to get sick to their stomach or to have a panic attack. There isn't a way for me to know that. And so does my responsibility only end as far as my knowledge goes? And if that's the case, then I am prioritizing a whole bunch of people over other people. And that in itself seems to have some kind of internal issues to me. So, yeah. And since you were kind enough to share yours. My dad died of lung cancer. We had to watch his slow decline. I was with him when he passed away, and there's so much emotional issues tied up in that. And then, of course, most of our audience knows that I am an anxiety warrior, and most of mine manifests as health related anxiety. And so anytime there is a commercial that comes on for cancer treatments, I get an immediate visceral physical reaction. My stomach drops, my heart starts pounding, my palms sweat. I have to change the thing or sometimes get up and walk away from the TV because I haven't been able to get to a place yet, and it's been years, where it doesn't affect me in a way that I don't want to have a part of it. So, but that's not the kind of trigger warning that we see, in a book or in anything else. I couldn't watch Breaking Bad. I couldn't make it through the first episode, but that's on me personally. Nobody would have known to warn the audience, hey, we're going to be talking about cancer, right? So that's part of my worry in the discussion and the tend toward making sure these things are there, that there's a lot of folks who are being left behind who may have triggers or deep emotional stressors tied to these issues that are nobody's ever going to be talking to them. And then that feels very much like preference. So I'm going to pull up Lindsay and Bobby, and then before I have you guys share, I'm going to go ahead and address the next couple of comments that were left in the chat. So Jean's saying, I ask about judgment because of the Will Smith mess. I feel like that example of someone being triggered and reacting badly to that trigger is a very complex topic, and one that I have yet to see anyone dissect fully. And for those folks who don't know, Will Smith slapped Chris Rock during the Oscars. And there is conversation around the fact that he grew up in an abusive home where he was not able to protect his mother. And so there's a very good chance that that experience was an emotional trigger for him. And you're right, I have not seen very many people discussing that also. Trish saying, speaking with friends, I would know what their triggers are. So of course, I would warn them, but not the general public. I wouldn't be able to determine what everybody feels comfortable with. And then Jean saying, I'm with Becca on facing fears, a great quote from a book I read, Facing Your Giants. Linger too long in the stench of your hurt, and you'll smell like the toxin you despise. Ooh, that's a really good visceral quote. Woof, that's a good one. So for where we're at so far, if you're just joining the conversation today, we are asking the question and having the discussion, should trigger warnings or should art include trigger warnings? Lindsay and Bobby have some thoughts. Lindsay, let's start with you. What are your thoughts on this question today?
Hi, Nicole. Hi, guys. Such a great conversation because it is so complex. And I have to say, first of all, I agree pretty much with Matt, with everything that Matt has had to say. And Nicole, having come out of cancer treatment myself in the last 6 months, I also understand the triggers. Whenever there's a cancer ad on television, I kind of run for the hills. And there's no trigger warning for those. It's just like, oh, God, I don't consider myself a cancer patient. So I have to run away from those. But I'm also a food photographer, right? And for me, where does a trigger warning start and end? Because, like you say, and same with Becca, it's like, okay, you have a visceral reaction to tall brunettes, and so you can't cater for everyone in the wider world of the great unwashed public, especially when it comes to art. And so it's like, I'm, as I said, a food photographer. I post a picture of a pig on a spit, and I have vegans literally sending me death threats. And and that's just that's not about anything serious like suicide or rape or domestic violence or cancer or really serious subjects. So this is just about what food people choose to eat. And so it's kind of like, how long is a piece of string? If you start with one trigger warning, where does that lead to? It's kind of, and how much does it take away from art? Like you said, if you give them a warning up front, does that diminish other people's response to art? If we said, if Andy Warhol had said, oh, by the way, you're about to see a whole bunch of genitalia in 1985, would that have, reduced the effect and awe and wonder of what he was doing with his art and why he's now one of the greatest artists of all time? So for me, as I said, I agree with Matt. I think people need to take a certain amount of personal responsibility to do enough research if they're going to walk into a gallery, or if they're going to be on TikTok or Instagram. You have the right to walk away from something if it doesn't feel good for you in your own personal circumstance. Is it up to the artist to do it? I don't think so. I think, yes, you want to be respectful, certainly in terms of physical stuff, but my take is I think Matt's spot on with this one.
Very much appreciate your thoughts, Lindsay, and so glad to hear you are on the done side of your treatments. So glad to hear that.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I'm kind of glad too.
Yeah, I can imagine. Oh, I have all feelings for you right now. Before we hear Bobby's feedback, we've got another comment going. Jean says, I'm with Becca on facing fears. Oh no, for some reason it's showing me that there's more comments, but apparently there's not. So we'll go ahead and hear from Bobby. What are your thoughts, good sir?
Good morning. I had to fumble for the mic button there for a moment.
Good morning.
I think there needs sometimes, the word triggered may be overused sometimes. And it happens to me. I sat down to watch a movie the other night and not expecting it, but a man's wife was suddenly killed. So that, hit me in a really personal way. And I wasn't really in the mood for that at that moment. But there are things that people are, I think, confusing being triggered with being offended. And I don't think we need to necessarily worry again about the offensive part of art, because some art is meant to offend. So it's kind of one of those, like Matt was saying, it's personal choice whether you want to do it or not do it, and maybe, more of a broad theme like, hey, this is an intense experience or things like that. So it doesn't bother me how people choose to do it. I don't do it. I don't think art should be censored or anything. But there was an opinion piece in the New York Times. Dave Kennerly wrote it just pretty recently, and it's talking. He's a photojournalist. He won a Pulitzer for Vietnam, the photos he shot. And his point was, he was talking about toward the end of it, he mentions about how they have the disclaimer at the top of articles and news things. Now there's warning, this is graphic material, so people aren't looking at it. And he kind of, is against even that, because, and I think I'm going to have to paraphrase the quote that he had in it, but the, photography of war may make you want to look away, but it's imperative that we do not. So, it's an interesting perspective from somebody, that was a photojournalist that photographed America. He was yeah, I'm sorry I didn't catch any of that. Or maybe you're not.
Anybody?
I think we were in a perfect storm of not being able to hear you or Bobby there for about 30 seconds.
Okay. Can you hear me okay now?
Perfectly. Yes. And Bobby too.
Okay, Bobby, go ahead. Hopefully. Okay, good. So we just went through some wonky.
Okay, I was just saying, Dave was one of the first. I think he was the first photographer on the ground at the Jonestown massacre, where there were, like 900, bodies laying around. So he's got some experience with that. So, it was, if people want to look at, you can just Google his name in the New York Times and it'll come up. But it was a interesting piece on the graphic nature of, photojournalism and photography, and then, he is a pretty strong believer that they should not be, these warnings to not look at the photos, because it's history, it's important, it's things, that need to be seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I when it comes to those kinds of things, I absolutely fall on that side. We don't want to look, but we must not look away. There's a human imperative there, almost, in recognizing and being forced to face what is happening, what being allowed to happen. all of those things. Look, so I'm going to say that one particularly concerned. For some folks, the issue is more on the gratuity side, but I would hope those of us who are doing work, it's not if we're showing that
We lost you again, Nicole.
okay, hopefully I'll continue the conversation, y'all.
So while Nicole gets into a better spot, hopefully people can hear me all right. Becca, I want to come back to you for a second. Have you heard anything that I know you've kind of, I don't want to say change your opinion, but you've been considering as you're going along? Has anything else changed, or is there another situation where you think trigger warnings might make sense? And again, this isn't like you have to answer this way. I'm just curious, is there like another situation? I know you're kind of searching before, but have you solidified an opinion one way or another yet?
No, I haven't. And it's something I've thought a lot about, just, being alive in the world, and especially like on the internet where trigger warnings are prevalent. And like, there's definitely situations where I've seen trigger warnings or seen requests for trigger warnings where I maybe harshly judge the use of them. Like trigger warnings, like, for showing like food or wealth, like because it upsets someone that they don't have access to those things, which then falls under that umbrella of offense. Like, is that truly a depiction of trauma, or is that something that just upsets you? And I don't know. I don't. I'm conflicted all around, and I have like on in my personal art. Well, I have not really. I don't think I've ever put a trigger warning on my own art. I have had people ask for it, and on various platforms, I have had to have stuff censored or blurred out and marked as like not safe for work, or like a gore warning or stuff like that. And it does personally upset me when I have had to do that, because I do feel like it takes away from the experience of the art, and I don't know. But again, I don't know if my art actually would create that visceral trauma response for someone if they see it, or is it just appeasing some algorithm, or something that recognizes shapes in an image, or just abiding by some rules that were put in place that aren't very clearly defined. So I don't know. I don't think that the use of them is in itself wrong or harmful in general. I think, that's something that is useful to people, like what's wrong with being kind. But I also don't necessarily still feel that it is my responsibility to do so as artist.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really interesting point too, right? As artists, our goal is to make our art and get it out there somewhere, right? People can see it. And if the only means to us that we have is social media, well, there's a way that you have to play by the rules of the game, right? You show a nipple on Facebook and you're basically sent to the gulag for the rest of your life. So understanding the platforms that you're using, the rules that are there, the things that you have to do, the hoops that you have to jump through just to get your art out, completely understandable that if you want to go that route, then there might be some things that you have to do. You could also say, I choose not to use that platform, and I am understanding that it might not be exposing my art to the widest possible group. So on every side, I think there are trade-offs, but from where the pure artist in me sits, I don't think it's my responsibility to cater to someone else's emotions. However, understanding that that's a very hard line to take, knowing that I do bend for things like social media, I try to be kind. I try to be empathetic. If I have any understanding of the person that I'm around, before I show them something, I might warn them about nudity or themes or something to that effect. I'm not, inhuman in that regard. I just think as a whole, I think when Nicole asked me earlier, should there be an expectation? I think that's where my nit is. I don't think there should be expectation of it, but I don't have any problem with doing it or having to comply if I am using that channel as a way to get my art out. I'd prefer not to, kind of like you. I'm like, kind of takes away. But if I want people to see it, then maybe I have to do this thing. I get it. But as a, if I had to take a hard line stance on it, I don't think there should be any expectation for any trigger warnings. Nicole?
Yeah, and I think it's the am I here?
I was just going to see if we had you back.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's where the difficulty arises. And I would surmise that nobody would have a problem with an individual artist following the dictates of their conscience if they wanted to include a trigger warning. And I think where some of the danger arises that I'm starting to see is that there is becoming group expectations for those kinds of things. And then in some of these communities, people negatively reacting to the artists who choose not to engage in those, and under the assumption that if they choose not to engage in them, it must mean that they are insensitive or cruel or anything else. And when you prefaced your comment earlier at the very beginning of the conversation, I was thinking to myself, well, nobody who knows you would ever think that you would do something out of pure cruelty or purposeful insensitivity, right? Like when you're having those comments, those of us who have been around you enough would never make that assumption. But then, of course, the danger becomes in some of these group and community politics that are happening, where that becomes the narrative. And so, as artists, depending on how we choose to approach this topic, we may end up falling in that category for people. And I think it's important for us to probably note that that is a danger. And should you choose to do this, the community politics or the group politics may end up not in your favor. And you have to be willing to live with that expectation if you can't change the politics of the group, right? Like that's quickly becoming a reality for many folks. Carol mentioning that it's only female nipples, which is absolutely true. Apparently male nipples are completely fine. Carol does have her hand up and we don't have much time, but I want to give her a chance to share her mind really quickly. Sorry, I know sometimes quickness is hard for you, Carol, but I was apparently not in a great reception space. But would love to have some chances to hear what your thoughts are before we start closing down for today.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Just gonna say that I feel like it's overused, and I think what was really good in this discussion is differentiating between offensive and trigger that is a physical response. And I mean, it's crazy. People will put themselves in the situation. Like 4th of July, this lady told us that she, when they do the finale, she might go into a seizure, and she did. And it's like, why is she there? So you kind of have to know your own thing. But I was gonna say I was in a discussion quickly. In Clubhouse, and it was about abuse. And at the beginning, before I spoke, they wanted people to do trigger warnings. I did. And I'm in the middle of saying what I said, something that happened to me when I was a kid. And we were there for that purpose, right? And somebody said, "You didn't say trigger warning." And that's why, I mean, it has become overused or maybe even misused. I understand the Vietnam vets, for example. I was in a class with them, and they like to come behind, creep up behind someone and clap their hands really loudly or break a bag and stuff to get the reaction of the other person. There is a real visceral response for that particular thing. But yeah, it's different with everybody. Nobody would know that brunettes would be a trigger. And so everybody kind of has their own, and there's special circumstances like PTSD that might be different. But then you do have the responsibility of, putting yourself in or out of a situation. But I do think it's been kind of overused. And thank you.
Yeah, which is always the struggle. And for those of us who are making art in its various forms, I think this is going to become a more and more relevant topic of conversation. So I'm really glad that we're having it now and beginning to feel out the field a little bit. I read an article this morning before settling on this conversation that was written about some of the trigger warnings that are happening in theaters. And then they asked students to respond to the article and give their thoughts. And the vast majority of these students were agreeing that they thought trigger warnings should be included in before things like plays. There were a few who disagreed, but that was the vast majority of folks. And there's a very real possibility that we might be moving towards a time where public opinion shifts in favor of something like trigger warnings. And so if these are the kinds of things that we want to have, then we need to be speaking out on it in places. And if these are the kinds of things we want to avoid, I think that's a discussion that we're going to end up having. So I'm really glad that we're able to have it here in a place where we can have this kind of discussion without the fear of, judgment or repercussion that can sometimes show up because of the question. I'm also super grateful to everybody who participated in the conversation today, everybody sharing really valid points and opinions. And as artists, I think we also have to be okay with the fact that sometimes we will offend, and sometimes we will hurt feelings, and sometimes we may even cause people to have a negative reaction that is part and parcel to the act of creating art. We are not always in the happy side of things, and that is not always what art is meant to be. And I think for me, in working through this question when it comes to books, there are some theaters, and I thought this might be a good idea, but it's something to consider for those of us who are making this kind of work, who said, if you need trigger warnings, look here. They don't make it a broad general statement for everybody, but they essentially say you can call the box office, or you can go here, and maybe for a book it can be, you can flip to the last page of the book. Where that's not going to be something that every reader has to go through, but for people who are looking out for their personal, mental, and emotional health, if they need trigger warnings, that may be a place that they can find them without dulling the experience of the book. But unfortunately, that's not something that we're able to do in many other places where things like photographs or illustrations are being seen. There isn't a way to do that without impacting how the viewer sees the work. And we've talked before about context, right? And the importance of context in how we interpret something, including something like that, like a trigger warning, absolutely gives context to the work that we're about to see and influences the way that we interpret it. So just a lot of nuance here and a lot of things to talk about and consider when we look these issues. And really super grateful to everybody who was part of the conversation today, and want to ask our moderators, do you have any final thoughts to leave folks with as we close down this conversation on the question, should art have trigger warning?
I feel like I've exhausted my opinion in many, many ways. I thought it was a great conversation.
Yeah, interesting stuff this morning, guys. What you just said, Nicole, about the context of how to present said trigger warning is interesting. Something I've been kind of musing on too. And I was thinking, like, if you turn on like a movie or a TV show or whatever, like on Netflix or I don't know, whatever on the TV, and it'll usually give you like up in the top corner, it'll be like sexuality, mild nudity, drug use or whatever. Like it gives you a bit of a rating and kind of a content warning of what is to be expected, and it's small and it's pretty unobtrusive, and then it disappears off the screen. And I imagine, like, so I haven't read this article you mentioned, but for plays, I think if someone is, like, say, already at the theater and there is a warning given before the play begins, they're already invested, right? And I think that choosing not to engage with it at that point is probably pretty unlikely. They probably have already done some semblance of research or have some idea of what's going to go on, and they're already there. So they may be just mentally or emotionally preparing themselves for that content when it arises. And I love that suggestion of call the box office, or having that last page of the book. That's brilliant. But how do we do that for more two-dimensional, digital, kind of visual art is an interesting beast to tackle. So I'm going to be thinking about that for a while.
For sure. Well, good conversation today, y'all. So glad we were able to have this, and exactly what I expected, everybody being wonderful adults who are able to have these conversations in a way that makes them so able to have. I appreciate that. thanks to everybody who was part of today's conversation. I hope we will be able to carry this on and continue to have these kinds of conversations. The link for the Facebook group is up above. So if you want to be able to maybe share some additional thoughts there, please feel free. Also, remember, we are still in the April challenge with the theme of love. So we would completely encourage everybody to go and make some art around that theme, however you interpret it, and share that in the group as a comment under the pinned post for the April challenge. And then, of course, we will be responding, liking, commenting, and the top responded to posts will then go into the live stream where we will use our visual literacy skills to try to figure out how these incredible artists have made us feel so much. And the image that we as moderators feel the most connected to will then go on to be the featured image in the blog and the banner image in the Facebook group with articles written about you and your work and an interview on our podcast with the wonderful Matt Stagliano. So we hope you will participate in that. We can't wait to see your work. In the meantime, there is always theartistforge.com where blog posts and podcasts are going up all the time with great information. And then, of course, we are here together every weekday morning, although that may change. Keep your eye out for that. But right now, every weekday morning at 7 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, that's 6 a.m. for the West Coast and 9 a.m. for the East Coast, afternoon for our friends overseas. Come and hang out with us where we learn to think like artists. In the meantime, go make something amazing, and we'll see everybody later. Bye, friends.